Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to today's conference entitled Education for Liberation. Thank you for getting up so early on a Saturday morning and coming out. So we are going to begin our program relatively soon. First, we will have some welcome remarks by the president of Union County College, the president of the Black Organization of Students of Rutgers Newark, and the vice president of Union County College. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Leibniz Martinez, and I am president of the student government at Union County College. Definitely thank you all for coming this morning, for getting up so early, and joining us here today. I especially also wanted to thank the people that were responsible for putting this together. The Organization of Black Faculty here at Rutgers Newark, the Black Organization of Students, Rutgers Newark, and the Student Government Association at Union County College. A special thanks and acknowledgement to Mr. Altariq Shabazz for his vision and drive in making today's event possible. It's a great honor for me to be here today representing Union County College and our diverse student population. I look forward to spending this day learning and being enlightened by all of that which will be brought forth by our featured speakers and panelists. This is a great day for education. I look forward to future collaborations such as this, which will help to develop and elevate the minds of my generation and of generations to come. May God bless, and may you have a great day.
Good morning, everyone. I said good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hello, my name is Jason Higgs. I am the president of the Black Organization of Students here at Rutgers University Newark. I just want to formally, on behalf of BOSS, welcome everyone here because a lot of work and preparation has been put into making this program possible. So we hope that you find this program informational and also exciting and at the same time educational. So with that said, let's get on with the program.
Good morning, everyone. And good morning. I would first like to start off by saying thank you for attending the event, and thank you to the Black Organization of Students, the Organization of Black Faculty and Staff here at Rutgers Newark, and my fellow officers at the Union County College's SGA. I would like to thank all of the panelists and the speakers who came. We didn't even have to ask them twice. They came, they agreed to do it. A lot of them without compensation. They just came because young people were willing and able to start talking about liberation when we know that there's a great need for liberation. So I would like to thank also my cousin, my late cousin, Sekou Sundiata, who gave us the book, A Nation Within a Nation. And The Nation Within a Nation is where the vision for the conference sprang from. And also, if I thank Sekou, then I have to thank Dr. Kamosi Woodard, who wrote the book, A Nation Within a Nation. So let's give Dr. Woodard and Sekou Sundiata a hand. But the young people here today, we're here, and us being here so early and being dedicated says that we're ready to receive the baton from the elder generation so we can start running our part of this race in the quest for liberation. A lot of our elders are tired, and it's time for them to go ahead and pass on the baton. So I want to thank all of you for coming, for taking your future seriously. And with that said, Professor Maxwell, we're ready. We're going to start our first panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Altariq. Our first panel discussion is entitled The Importance of the Political Mobilization of the Hip-Hop Generation and Connecting the Civil Rights and Black Power Generations with the Hip-Hop Generation. We'll first have a presentation by Dr. Peniel Joseph, who is Professor of African American Studies at Brandeis University. He will be speaking about Waiting to the Midnight Hour, the Black Power Movement, and the Hip-Hop Generation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. It's very good to be here. Thanks to Al Tariq for extending the invitation. What I want to talk about really in just 15 minutes, because that's the time that I have, is the Black Power movement, civil rights, and the hip hop generation. This conference is called Education for Liberation. I perceive of this and think of this conference as a Black Power conference. I'm from New York City, born and raised, Harlem and Southside Jamaica, Queens. I preface my remarks by saying that because I was born in 1972, I'm 35 years old, and I was part of that Black Power generation as a baby. I was part of it as a baby and as a young adult. From 1972 in that Gary Convention to Public Enemy and Fight the Power and the resurgence of Malcolm X and black nationalism in the late 80s and early 1990s, when hip hop really had a message in the mainstream. And I think what we're seeing in 2007 is really a resurgence of the movement for self-determination, radical black self-determination. So what I want to talk about briefly is how can we connect the so-called civil rights generation to the hip-hop generation, but really for a movement for black power. Because sometimes we talk about being in the post-civil rights era, but we never say we're in a post-black power era. And I think that we are in a post-black power era. I want to discuss why a lot of times until recently we haven't as a nation wanted to remember the black power era. 1967, 40 years ago, we celebrate the 40th, or we commemorate the 40th anniversary of urban rebellions in Newark, New Jersey, and in Detroit. Most mainstream publications this past year remembered 1967 as the summer of love. It wasn't the summer of love, it was the summer of urban rebellions and civil disturbances all across the United States and real radical protest activism at the local, national, and international level. We're here today at the Paul Robeson Center, and that's a good place to start because Paul Robeson in the 1940s is the world's most well-known figure and an international political mobilizer and peace activist. It's Paul Robeson who spreads a vision of radical Pan-Africanism that's building upon W.E.B. Du Bois, building upon Carter G. Woodson, and really amplifying the local activism of people like Ella Baker in the streets of New York City. So in the 1940s, there's a freedom surge in the United States and a movement for radical democracy that's going to spread from Harlem to Dixie's cradle of Birmingham, Alabama, to shop floors in Detroit, Michigan, out west to post-war boom towns of Los Angeles and Oakland. And we think about that freedom surge, the Cold War is going to impact that freedom surge. The Cold War is going to lead to the deportation of C.L.R. James, Claudia Jones. W.E.B. Du Bois is going to be tried as a foreign agent, and Robeson's passport is going to be revoked. He's going to be under virtual house arrest between 1951 and 1959. What's interesting about the 1950s is that Malcolm X is going to serve as a bridge between two generations of black radicals. There's going to be a younger generation, people like Leroy Jones, Sonia Sanchez, and there's going to be an older generation who are part of the Harlem Writers Guild, people like Vicki Garvin, John Henrik Clark, Julian Mayfield, and John Oliver Killings. And when we think about Malcolm X, who was Malcolm X? We usually think about Malcolm as an iconic figure and not as a radical local political organizer and intellectual. Malcolm Little was on the fringes of the freedom surge of the 1940s. He was a self-confessed criminal, dope, thief, and hustler who served 6 years in Charlestown, Massachusetts prison between 1946 and 1952. When he comes out of prison in 1952, and by the time he arrives in Harlem in 1954, Malcolm X is a transformed political revolutionary in 1954, which is the same year as the Brown versus Board of Education decision, May 17th of 1954. So when we look at Malcolm X's political activism is going to parallel the so-called heroic period of the civil rights movement. When we think about that heroic period of the civil rights movement, that's between 1954 and 1965. And we've got an arc to that heroic period with the Brown decision, the assassination of Emmett Till, the Montgomery bus boycott strike, Little Rock, Central Arkansas, and the desegregation crisis of 1957, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and SNCC's direct protest activism, 1963 and the spring of Birmingham, Alabama, August 28, 1963, the March on Washington, September 16th, 4 black girls are assassinated in Birmingham, Alabama at the 16th Street Baptist Church. And in 1964 and 65, we've got the passage of the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act. Now, that's a neat, nice arc of the heroic period of the Civil Rights Movement. Paralleling that heroic period is a modern movement for black power that's going to be led by Malcolm X. And we think about Malcolm X, what did he do? Well, Malcolm is going to confront American democracy's jagged edges of violence, poverty, incarceration, institutionalized racism, and local and national terror against black people. Malcolm's going to confront that at the local, the national, and international level, even in the 1950s. We often think of Malcolm as having transformed himself once he left the Nation of Islam. That is not true. Malcolm is visiting the Middle East as early as 1959 and is a heroic political activist who's talking about human rights and talking about transcending American imperialism, transcending institutional racism, and creating a new body politic in the 1950s. With the short amount of time that I have, I want to streak forward to the 1960s, talk about Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and then connect this with the hip hop generation. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, is the person who unleashed this term black power nationally on June 16, 1966 in Greenwood, Mississippi. And when we think about Stokely Carmichael is really one of the most important political figures, black or white, of the second half of the 20th century. It's Stokely Carmichael who spent his 20th birthday in a prison farm in Mississippi in 1961 for civil rights activism. Between 1960 and 1966, Carmichael is arrested 27 times and is one of the few Americans who put his life on the line to bleed for a notion of American democracy where democracy was best etched in the faces of black sharecroppers who were poor, who were semi-literate, who were illiterate, and who would never have birth certificates or death certificates in the Mississippi Delta, in Lowndes County, Alabama, and other parts of the Deep South, the Black Belt South. In '66, when Carmichael yells black power, he's yelling black power because he's advocating for radical black self-determination, that black people, by any means necessary, will take control of their own destinies. But he's linking black power to a human rights movement. It's Carmichael, before Dr. King, who's America's leading anti-war protester. Before King's Riverside address on April 4th, 1967, it's Carmichael who's leading chants of 10,000 students at Berkeley, hell no, we won't go. It's Carmichael who's going all around the world, from London to Cuba to Algeria to Tanzania, Vietnam, and China in 1967 to talk about human rights activism. When we think about how does this connect to the hip hop generation and the contemporary generation, well, it's really simple. What the contemporary generation needs right now is a sense of their own history. They need a sense of how they got to this place in 2007. When we think about the hip hop generation, there's 3 generations of that hip hop generation. I'm one of them at 35 years old. Sometimes we think they're only 15 or 16 or 17, and the media makes them perpetually youthful. But when we think about this hip hop generation, it's coming out of the context of the 1970s and post-industrialization, and we're thinking about the first aspect of that hip hop generation, even before Africa Bambaataa and Kool Herc and the Bronx is Burning in the late 1970s, we're really thinking about aspects of that black arts movement and that black power movement. And groups like The Last Poets, Gil Scott-Heron, obviously Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni, the Watts Prophets, the spoken word that tried to transform art into politics. Larry Neal argued that the black arts movement was the cultural arm of the black power movement, and I think he was correct. When we think about this contemporary hip hop generation and the potential that this hip hop generation has, and we see it with the work being done in terms of the politics of Katrina, we see it with the Gina 6 in Louisiana. Black power provides a potential framework for this contemporary hip hop generation. And I don't mean black power in an uncritical way. I mean advocating and looking at the shortcomings, the mistakes, the failures of this black power movement, but also seeing the way in which this black power movement not only scandalized American democracy, but transformed American democracy. The very fact that we call ourselves black people and African American and Afro-American, this is from the black power movement. The cultural identity that we have, that's the black power movement. The push for black studies being institutionalized all over the United States and the world and cultural centers, that's this movement for black power. The name changes that we've adopted, and we have those folks with us today, that's the black power movement. So the black power movement provides a context for radical self-determination for the 21st century for our young people. And we saw hip hop embrace aspects of that black power movement in the late 80s, early 1990s, only to be really overtaken and replaced with a corporate type of hip hop that really extols the most violent, the most retrograde, the most backwards impulses of the black community collectively. But those impulses are not our mainstream impulses. I think we saw the mainstream impulses with groups like Public Enemy, with groups like X-Clan, with groups like Tribe Called Quest, and they were usurped by corporate America. And that's what we're feeding our kids right now. And we're feeding BET and videos, but there's another context. There's Eldridge Cleaver talked about a new day in Babylon, a house cleaning in Babylon. Stokely Carmichael talked about a revolution in Babylon. When we think about our contemporary period, the black power movement can provide a paradigm or a framework or a blueprint for our young people. And in closing, I think it's great that everybody got here early this Saturday morning and felt that it was an important enough event to come out. The change that we want to see, we have to be. And as soon as we leave these doors, that's where that change begins. One of the things I can tell young people, the biggest thing that we need to know is our history. We need to read in this age of iPods, this age of the internet, this age of the computers. We need to read books that have footnotes and endnotes. Malcolm X said to make it plain. As long as the brothers and sisters who are writing these books have made it plain and it's not trying to your words and language, you need to read that. We need to be armed with knowledge for this potential revolution that we're trying to set off. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Very powerful. Now we will have our panelists, and I'd like to quickly introduce them to everyone. First, as you know, we have Dr. Peniel Joseph. Next to Dr. Joseph is Al-Tariq Shabazz, who is the Vice President of the Student Government Association at Union County College. Then we have Mr. Herb Glenn, Chairman of the Political Action Committee for the Newark NAACP, and also President of We Care Partnership for Public Awareness. Then we have Dr. Akil Kalfani, who is Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at Essex County College. He is also Director of the Africana Institute at Essex County College, as well as Acting Director of Urban Issues of the Urban Issues Institute. And finally, we have Tynesha McHarris, who is a student of Rutgers Newark. She also is Director of Bethany Cares Incorporated. I will begin with a question for any of our panelists. How can the hip-hop generation, which historically is a cultural and political movement, transform its current situation as a capitalistic, corporate, violent movement? I'll repeat the question.
No, test, hello. I don't know if my mic is. Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me here. And if we think about what the corporate media objective is in in not just with the hip hop generation, but with anything, it's about making money. So they don't really care how they make money. It's just they make money, right? They don't care if it's slavery, right? I mean, if we remember back, not too far, they don't care how they make money as long as they make money. So if we understand the context of what their interests are, we understand how we have to interact with them. We understand that we cannot be controlled by them. I think Du Bois set a good example for us. He suggested that we need to think outside the box. He was unsatisfied with how things were going in the United States, and so he began to do things differently. He understood that even though he had a PhD, he was not welcome and incorporated in the United States context, right? And so ultimately, he went with Nkrumah and left the United States, and he's not the only one who did such thing. But I think we have to, when we're thinking about what we have to do as younger folks, and we all young to a certain extent, that we all have to figure out ways that we can not just see what's on the table in front of us, but we can begin to transform things, and we can begin to look at what our elder generation did, and what they did was they didn't accept what was on the table. They were unwilling to be comfortable, right? Because if you think about the Panthers, if you think about Garvey, if you think about Malcolm X, they had to be uncomfortable. And we want to be comfortable. We're afraid of being uncomfortable. We're afraid that somebody might look at us funny, or afraid that we might get arrested. Well, they knew they were going to get arrested, right? Malcolm X didn't say that he thought he might die. He knew he was going to die. King said the same thing. But the reality is that even within that context, they realized that they had to be willing to sacrifice something. And what young folks today often, unfortunately, are willing to sacrifice is themselves for causes that are not as great as what they were talking about. We have to get back to thinking about what Kwame Ture used to say all the time. And he used to say that it don't matter what organization you belong in, but get in an organization that's progressive and about change. If we begin to think that these young brothers and sisters who are in gangs and other things, they're in organizations, but the organizations that they're in are not about positive change. If you could transform those organizations to positive change, then we would be doing something. If we can begin to get them to think about that they are in organizations and that they can do positive change outside of that organization, whether it's creating a new one or joining something that's positive, we would be able to begin to bridge that transformation. And we have to be holistic in our approach. We can't just assume that the corporate piece is a piece that's going to work for us. And I think that since brothers and sisters are so attracted to money, we may end up having to pay them to write positive songs and produce positive songs. If we need some of our collective resources to do something like that, then maybe we need to think about it that way. Having them pay them, for instance, if there was a song out by Busta Rhymes that was, I can't remember the name of the songs now, it was a song that looked at some alcohol song, I can't remember what the name was, but Cavassier. Well, but what most people didn't know is that he had a deal with Cavassier. That wasn't just something that he was doing. Cavassier and Busta Rhymes had a contract. And so his contract was about raising money for Cavassier, and they raised more money after that song than you would think, right? And so if we think that we can have to do it that way, we may have to, for lack of a better term, co-opt the movement, right? If we co-opt the hip-hop movement to help them to understand that they got to do something different, then maybe that's what we need to do. Maybe that'll be a starting point, since right now we can't seem to get Public Enemy back out there. We can't seem to get a new Public Enemies, right, to do it.
I think what Brother Calfani is trying to say is, let's identify where our real power is. We understand that hip-hop is a corporately controlled machine now. And to terrorize a Malcolm X phrase, making a profit by any means necessary. But where do we have real power? It's a vicious cycle now. We know that the majority of consumers are white American kids from the Middle West. So, but at the same time, these white American kids from the Middle West are listening to music they think black kids are listening to. Young black America sets the trends all around the world. That is real power. You go to South Africa and there's a big, this is the craziest thing, in South Africa, in Cape Town, the most influential gang in South Africa is called the Americans. So using that as real power, then you have these young black American people that corporate America tells what to like. So corporate America tells young black America what to like, and then white kids will buy it. and then we make a profit. So using that as real power, how can we influence a generation of people that only has the TV and BET to listen to? We need to get involved and empower our young people and have them understand what their actual power is, which means you set the trends so we can actually control the machine.
Well, I have a little different outlook on the role of hip hop because I don't think it's as much of a problem, the negative hip hop, as we make it out to be. I agree with Amiri Baraka. When I spoke to him, he said that it's a diversion. It's a diversion in terms of keeping your eyes set off of the real goal. You know, he said to me that, 50 tells us to get rich or die trying, when most of us would die trying to get rich. So that's the thing, it's a diversion. But if you took hip hop out of the equation, it will still be the nation's behavior in our communities. Everything will still be there. So if all of everything on our agenda is the same thing that Frederick Douglass was talking about, or Nat Turner. So therefore we know that these issues are not new issues. So we're not the authors of these issues. We're not the author of these problems. We're dealing with the same thing that progressive black people in the past were dealing with and Negroes decided not to deal with. We're dealing with the same things. So I believe that it's a diversion from keeping us focused. And another thing is that I don't know how much we should censor art. I don't know how much we should do that, because then we become like the fascists if we want to censor art too much. Because it's the conditions that our people are in that produce these problems that we have. Because if the majority of children who are listening to hip hop are in the Midwest, why they're not Bloods and Crips, why they're not selling crack, because they're not in the same social conditions as us. So we can talk about hip hop and how it can be used as an apparatus, as propaganda to promote the movement, but it's not the problem. And we can't allow anyone to tell us that hip hop is the problem. White supremacy, imperialism, neocolonialism, these are true problems. 50 Cent is not the problem.
But, I had a chance to piggyback on all these remarks. And one of the things that I saw was very idealistic in the presentation that Dr. Joseph brought to us, is that we inherently need to understand what our history is and to get a better handle on recognizing what those evolutions really transpired into. When I was growing up, rap was what we did when we talked to girls at parties. We were rappers, we were, hey, you had the gift for the gab. And then it transcended into the situation of hip hop, whereas in hip hop, it was how well you were able, to scratch the record, to transcend from one particular music thing to another. We were into Stevie and into, Where Are All My Friends, and the kinds of records that related to us in regard to our emotional atmosphere and the contacts that we were making in our community. The radio stations, we had, Gil Scott-Heron playing on the radio, and we were able to recognize that there was a theme that can be transpired by talking about your issues and concerns, and it brought about the basis for the hip hop. I don't believe that hip hop is a movement, and I think that as Dr. Joseph points out in terms of it, when we look in terms of recognizing Amiri Baraka and some of the entertainers that transcended into a movement that brought about a revolution of national awareness, indicating that we don't need to be oppressed in this day and age. That if we come together, if we become liberators, if we show that there is pride in our culture, that we can begin to show a standard that people can learn from. And we really need to read more.
Thank you. I failed to mention, I would like to encourage the audience that if you have questions, please submit them, raise your hand. We would like an interactive conference today, so please submit your questions.
How you doing? My name is Raz Baraka. I think, our kids are reading, they just read Be More Careful and, those kind of ghetto like novels and stuff that's out. And what we have to understand is that when you talk about the Black Arts Movement, or you talk about something prior to hip hop, this stuff happened in the midst of a larger movement. They weren't asking James Brown to lead the March on Washington. James Brown expressed what the March on Washington was about. You know, the whole movement itself. We are asking rappers and hip hop artists to be the leaders because we refuse to be. They have access to things, and they have access to corporate money, and they can talk to 1 million kids at one time, but we have failed to capture these young people's imagination. Because of that, these people have more control over young people than we do. They actually like them better than you. And then the question becomes, why are these people more important to them than you are? I mean, why are they willing? And so that's like people, and I'm an educator, that's why people always say young people don't like authority, which is a lie. Because why put yourself in a gang if you don't like authority? I mean, because actually when you're in a gang, you have authority. They just don't like your authority. So then the question becomes why they don't like your authority. What are you not doing that you should be doing to make these young people understand what they should be doing? And because we're not doing that, we don't have a clue of how to organize these folks, or refuse to, you know, we actually find other people to be the fault of what's going on. American imperialism is a constant. It's always been a constant. You know what I mean? There have been music that denigrated black women, that was violent, that talked bad about our community for centuries. Since we came here, you can find blues songs, you know, that talk dirty about sex, about violence, about all kinds of things. You can find that in all kinds of music, but that wasn't the predominance of what was going on, because there was a revolutionary movement happening. There is no real revolutionary movement happening now outside of the Bloods and the Crips. Simply put, until we develop a revolutionary movement that is plausible, then you will always see this backward kind of stuff that's out here, because they're being led by corporate America, and they don't really have any direction or vision. They just know they want to fight. But who to fight is a problem. Bloods say brotherly love override oppression and destruction. Crips say community revolution in progress. But brotherly love override oppression, they think other black people are oppressing them. They're right, some black people are oppressing them, they just haven't identified which ones. You know, they haven't identified who's actually oppressing them. And that's our job. It's not Tupac's job. It's certainly not 50 Cent's job. I don't want 50 Cent to tell anybody that I know that are my children who their oppressors are.
That's right.
That's not his job. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. I had another question, but based on his response, I changed my question. So my question now is, should we be, in quotes, picking on the hip-hop generation? What do we actually expect of them?
I'm gonna try to tackle that one for a second. I mean, part of what's going on here, there's a generational context, but there's also a problem of historical contextualization. Because when we think about hip hop, it's like this debate between Bill Cosby and some of his critics. Cosby had an NAACP speech in '04 where he just basically attacked the poor black community, basically saying they had babies out of wedlock, they weren't living up to their end of the deal with civil rights. He said folks with Muslim names, they were all in jail. He wondered why black people protested when some of us were shot by the police, when we were in fact committing crimes, because he said somebody gets shot in the head with a piece of pound cake, but they did steal the pound cake. And a lot of, but here's the point, and Cosby has a new book with Alvin Poussin, about, you know, victims to victors, and basically telling black people to just get up off your asses and just do it, right? And he's with Jesse Jackson and Rainbow Push Coalition. Here's the thing, a lot of black people agree with Cosby, and not just the black bourgeoisie. A lot of African Americans. I've had a chance the past couple of years to speak to thousands of black people in the United States and overseas, and they agree with Cosby. And that's one of the things we have to understand. Well, why did they agree with Bill Cosby that our kids really have failed to live up to their end of the deal, and that people are in perpetual generational poverty like Katrina? Because remember, the people in Katrina who couldn't get out and had no cars, these are folks who've been living in perpetual generational, you know, Ward 8 since the antebellum slave period, right? And we have to understand, why do people agree with Cosby? We know why white America agrees with him and why he's on Meet the Press and getting all this mainstream press. We know that. But I'm saying, how come so many of our people, including working class black people, including black people on public assistance, and here's what I'm gonna say. What we need is a more nuanced understanding of what's going on. Because on one level, you've got Cosby, who does this complete demonization. And you've got people like Dyson, who do a whole-scale defense, right? A whole-scale defense. And basically, anything our young people say is cool. They can say motherfucker this, they can say nigga this, nigga that, and it's cool, right? Here's the thing. I'm coming from New York City, raised by a mom, single mother, Haitian immigrant who came here in '64. It wasn't cool to curse, and it wasn't cool to use the N-word. With some of the hip-hop public intellectuals who think that that's cool, right? Racism produces predators. There are people in our community who are preying on poor people. There's people in our community who are preying on older sisters with Social Security checks, right? We have to find a way to disaggregate from a whole-scale blame, but also a whole-scale defense. And when we think about what, I understand what Al Tariq was saying, but hip-hop is part of the problem. It's not the only problem, and we shouldn't let white America or black America scapegoat hip-hop, because what's going on now is certain people are almost blaming hip-hop for cancer. You know, it's causing cancer, crime, cigarette smoking, anything you want, it's the cause of it. It's not the cause, it's the reflection. The reason why the Frank Lucas movie makes so much money, it's a reflection. America is American gangster. When we talk about liberal democratic capitalism, George Bush, Hillary Clinton, everyone is trying to get rich or die trying by any means necessary, and hip-hop becomes a reflection of that. What we did during the Black Power movement, we weren't trying to be part of the mainstream. We were saying we were going to build our own institutions. We said we didn't want to be part of a decaying, dying society. We were going to build Pan-African paradises in Newark, New Jersey, in Oakland, in Los Angeles, in New Orleans, in Atlanta, in Harlem. That's what we wanted to do. We didn't say we wanted to be part of this problem. And Du Bois said it, Malcolm X said it, Kwame Ture said it, but Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, the whole notion of Ella Baker's more than just a hamburger speech, she said, look, the SNCC folks were not sitting in to get a hamburger at what James Baldwin calls sleazy lunch counters. Sleazy lunch counters in the South to get tasteless cups of coffee. They were trying to recreate a society that was dying and decaying. So what we have to understand when it comes to hip-hop, the worst aspects of hip-hop are mirror images of American culture, white and black American culture. These young people want big houses, 4,600 square feet by any means necessary. They want big cars, SL Mercedes-Benz by any means necessary, and they're willing to kill and run over their own people to do it. But we have to understand that we've got a generational divide, and many, many black people who have bought into the system have nothing but contempt for this hip-hop generation.
Briefly, I was just going to make a comment that, you know, when we think about when you talk about the origins of the movement, I really think that we really have to go back, right? We oftentimes talk about the origins of whether it's the hip-hop movement or a Black Power movement as starting in the 60s, but really we need to go back further than that, right? Because the whole history and legacy of what we're talking about, Garvey, Du Bois, Henry Sylvester Williams, really when you start talking about Pan-Africanist ideals, that's where they came from. Henry Sylvester Williams held the first Pan-Africanist conference in 1900, right? Du Bois was writing about the Negro problem in 1800s. And until we begin to go back and look at that history and you see how that relates to what we're talking about today, then we kind of miss what's going on. We miss the reality of our ancestors bringing stuff to the table. And we need to contextualize that. We need to not just look at the generation gap now, but we need to bridge all those gaps. We need to look at from ancient Kemet, right? We need to begin to talk about what Ptahhotep was talking about. So we have this moral ethic that we begin to re-employ about what's going on in our community. And once we begin to look at it from that perspective, we have a long history of successes that we see, and we begin to connect those pieces. And so when our young folks begin to think about the Sankofa, right, return to the source that when you begin to bridge the gap and think outside the box and begin to incorporate the entirety of African experience from a holistic perspective, then you begin to see it. What Al Tariq was saying, what Brother Joseph was saying, if we look at those things collectively, right, then we begin to get a whole picture, because it's not about blaming anyone, but it's about that there's blame to go around. But we also have to look at it from sociological, psychological, cultural, historical, spiritual, dietary, all these different perspectives bring to the table a part of what the problem is, but also the whole of what the solution is. And we need to begin to focus on solutions. We need to stop embedding ourselves in talking about and dealing with problems, but begin to embed ourselves on solutions.
Thank you. I have a question from Milton Conway of the International Youth Organization. He asks, how should we identify the hip-hop generation in terms of age, class, and race? And also, what's the difference between a black and a nigger? As quoted from White Cop from Deep Cover. Mr. Shabazz.
Well, I think that you have to answer for yourself what a black person and what a nigger is, because Dr. Joseph has a view on that. I have a different view on that. But my view is, whether I use the word or not, I'm going to make that decision. See, these conversations that we have among ourselves come from other people. They're not organically grown. So what I'm saying is that we should not be basing what we do and say off our relationship with the outside community. You know, when we're sitting around our kitchen tables, before it was on Fox, the N-word, did our grandmothers really talk about that? Did we really talk about you shouldn't say that word? Do we really have contempt for our brother and look at him as less than a human when we say the word? Not me, not people I grew up with. So, and then how do we identify the hip-hop generation in terms of class? And I don't know. I don't have that answer.
Mr. Black?
Again, as I mentioned earlier, hip-hop is not a movement. It's an art form. It's something that is entertaining. And we have been putting a lot of emphasis on it because of the economic potential that it predicts. But we fail to recognize the behavioral content that it creates, and it institutionalizes a particular way in which individuals react to it. When I said that we need to read more, I'm sitting, and I'm proud of it, between two African Americans that have written books that have intimate knowledge and understanding of how we evolved to where we are today. We can sit in institutions and have this type of a dialogue. We need to continue to enforce those kinds of movements. Hip-hop is no more of a movement than I believe jazz or R&B is. But I do know that there are a growing population of individuals who enjoy listening to it. If it was so much of the extent that we did have those kinds of individuals that were interested in what we're doing, this place would be filled. This place needs to be filled when we're talking about topics of dealing with our future. And that's what I'm talking about. We need to stop emphasizing hip hop as a movement. It is not a movement. Empowerment of political consciousness comes from the platforms that you have to use it as a vehicle. The hip hop artists are not trying to empower themselves to create a political movement. All they're doing is trying to excite the minds of our young to buy their records.
Well, I would say in terms of that, I think that hip hop, it is a movement. I mean, I think it's a cultural movement though, which is different from being a political movement. So the thing about a cultural movement is that a cultural movement generally reflects the political climate of an era. So when we think about jazz in the 1930s and 40s, it's very much reflecting that. Blues and Billie Holiday, Strange Fruit. It's reflecting a lynching culture in America that black people are protesting against. We think about James Brown, and Roz was talking about, you know, I say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud, and Curtis Mayfield, which we were playing earlier, and Marvin Gaye, What's Going On. And that What's Going On album, 1971, it's a masterpiece, but guess what? It's late. It's late. It's a late masterpiece because people were talking about that in the late 60s, and certainly Gil Scott-Heron and Sonia Sanchez and Baraka and all these other folks. What you have with hip hop, it's a cultural movement that's expressing decay in late capitalist society. It's expressing a kind of decay, a kind of political decay, but it's also, at times, it expresses something very energetic, very innovative. Because one of the things we haven't talked about today, I saw Public Enemy on Tabitha Smiley, and Professor Griff and Chuck D were talking about what we need is quality and not quantity. So we need quality individuals such as yourselves who came here today, who are reading, who are into progressive hip hop, who are into social and political change. So even if we're educators, we can't reach millions of people. If we can reach thousands of soldiers who are willing to put their bodies on the line and willing to put their minds and their time on the line, then we're going to be in much better shape than we are now. In terms of the N-word and black people, I think that I understand what Al Tariq is saying, and sometimes the controversy over the N-word has been an external controversy, but I think it's also historically been an internal controversy, and it's based on class as well. In terms of when we think about the roots of that word, the roots of that word are in racial slavery and white supremacy to denigrate African Americans. Our young people are disconnected from the historical context of the word, so they're saying, look, I'm using it as a term of endearment. And certainly slaves, enslaved Africans were called that word so many times, they started to use it themselves and started to apply all kinds of meanings and connotations. But it is a word that needs to be banned. We don't see our Jewish brothers and sisters calling themselves negative anti-Semitic slurs. If they were saying it in rap music, that would not fly because corporate America wouldn't let it happen. The only reason we can denigrate ourselves this way, using the N-word and calling our sisters the B-word and the H-word, is because we're black. If we tried to say this stuff against other ethnic groups, these things would not be published, okay? There is no freedom of speech in the United States, okay? You have to understand that. Corporate America would put the kibosh on these records if we were saying anti-Semitic slurs. It would stop today. It would stop today. We can only get this 50 Cent stuff because we're calling each other nigga. That's the only reason we can say it. You know, if we were trying to say this against B'nai B'rith and different folks would be out and it'd be over. Jay-Z, whoever wants to say it, you don't have enough money or power to do it. Period. Okay?
Let me just say one thing. It's just one thing. Let me ask two questions. By show of hands, how many of you in here are hip-hop artists? Okay. Now, by show of hands, how many of you are in here a member of the People's Organization Progress? How many of you are in here are members of the Black Panther Party? Okay. All right. How many of you are in here that are members of the NAACP?
Yeah, right here.
To me, those are movements. Hip hop is not a movement.
Well, I think hip hop is a movement. If you ask anybody in the room who's a part of the National Hip Hop Political Convention, I am. So and it's also unfair whenever you kind of blanket all hip hop artists as being 50 Cent, T.I., Nelly. Who's heard of Immortal Technique, Hassan Salam, Jean Grey? There are hip hop artists that are using hip hop as a tool to galvanize people, to set an agenda so that we can move forward. But back to the first question too, how do you identify the hip hop generation? It depends on who you ask. You go to some hip hop standards, they say anybody under 40. You go to some people, it says anybody under 25, and sometimes even 12-year-olds. So it just shows you how many people are searching for an identity. But to me, the hip hop generation really represents folks 35 and under who look at hip hop as a movement and will use hip hop in order to move us forward for self-determination.
Well, it's been around for 30 years, so it's got to be different than 35 and under. We've got, the problem is that's the Nightline notion of that. It's just been around since 1979, so the hip hop heads are only 35. There's folks who are 50 and 55, 60 who are deep in the game. These are the folks who, in 1979, 1980, these were the folks who were pressing the records. They were in Southside Jamaica, Queens. They were in Bronx, New York. I was there. I just was a shorty. So I know when we think about hip hop, the age set is going to be, there's people on Social Security who are hip hop heads and aficionados, okay? So part of our problem is that corporate America just identifies 35 and under, and a young group of kids, many of whom have no historical knowledge or context of a movement that they're a third generation a part of, or maybe late second generation. So certainly, absolutely not is it 35 and under. Absolutely not, okay? That's not true. Historically, that's just absolutely not true.
All right, all right.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremiah Smith, representing International Youth Organization. And I just would like to make a statement. I believe that hip hop is more than just a movement. I believe it's a way of life. Because a lot of people look at it and they don't know them as, oh, I could have been that, but I'm this. I mean, it doesn't always show the negative points, it shows some positive points. And most of these rap songs that you hear, you really need to listen to the song. It's not telling you, oh, go grab a gun. It's telling you, look, I made the wrong decision. Now it's your choice to make the right one. And I also had a question. How do you show the young brothers and sisters, this is what you came from, you do belong, instead of showing them you don't belong, and I rebuke this?
I think that the question is a great question because, you know, I mean, I'm a few years older than Brother Panel, but I would say that in the context of understanding hip hop, that I grew up with hip hop also, right? And that I used to play, I used to have a radio show when I was an undergrad in California. So I played hip hop on the radio at that time. So I understand the context of it, and so that how does it fit within the context and how you begin to do that? I think that what we have to do is to begin to do it by showing, right? And that we all have to, as my brother Bruti Kafele says, you got to man up, right? So brothers have to stand up and be willing to go out to the community and talk with and interact with brothers and sisters in a way that it encourages them to do something, right? That encourages them and supports them, right? That we have to support you, but we also have to guide you. It's our responsibility to provide guidance for our young brothers and sisters in doing what they do. Malcolm always had John Henry Clark or somebody else who would pass him a note. Say, look, you want to know some facts? You want to know what's going on? Here's the truth, right? And then he would employ that truth in his understanding of the collective reality of what's going on. And so every time we think about our elders and our relationship with them, we have to begin to respect that relationship. And part of it is that we have to help young folks understand what it means to respect that relationship. It means that you have to be willing to sit down and listen, right? We have to learn how to listen to one another. And a lot of times we don't want to, but because our elders are telling us sometimes things we don't want to hear. But if we learn one thing, and that is that there's so many lessons to be learned. Well, let me take a step back. One of the best lessons that I ever learned was the lesson of learning lessons, right? What that means is that everything you do, there's a lesson to be learned in it. But you have to be open and receptive to getting that experience. So when you fail, that failing is leading to your next success. But if we don't see it as that way, we see ourselves as down and not able to move forward. If we see that as a piece of learning of how we're going to get to where we're headed ultimately, then we begin to doing things differently. So that's how we have to approach it. So go talk to your elders, brother, and sit down and just listen. And when they say stuff that you don't like, just listen. You don't be combative about it. Just listen, and you take what's useful out of it and you move forward.
But I just want to say something really briefly to the brother's comment too. A lot of times there is a generational divide where, you know, the elders will tell us to read, but won't listen to the hip hop tracks that they're criticizing. Yeah, so I think that there should be a reciprocal relationship when it comes to research.
We have a few minutes left. We have 2 questions briefly, and panelists, could you give a brief response? Thank you.
Good evening, afternoon, everybody. My name is Ulysses Coleman, and I'm an activist. I'm 57 years old, born and raised in Newark. Do you know what happened in '69? I know what happened in '67. I was out there. What you are doing up here is comparing music with your culture. I'm also the recruiter for Bloomfield College in a course called the Kelman Course in Humanities. And it takes you back to the time you left Africa, came to America, Martin Luther King, Why We Can't Wait, philosophy, the matrix philosophy. Which pill you want, the red pill, the blue pill? Or do you want to live in that dream or wake up into the reality that's going on in your neighborhoods? Trust and believe what you're saying up here, it sounds nice. Turn the TV off, turn the music off. Get control of your family, find God in your life. You want change? Change yourself first. Change your attitudes. Don't worry about what somebody else is playing, what somebody else is watching, or what somebody else is wearing. When you go downtown Newark, you see more sneaker stores. I can't find a decent pair of shoes. You see jeans. You know what? I used to wear bell bottoms. I walked with Bambergers before they put the dogs in the window in '67. We tore my neighborhood up, and it's still tore because I still see it today.
Can I respond to one of the other issues regarding the language of the hip hop today? In the earlier parts of, again, the art form of hip hop, it was really about the music. It was about listening. I would ask my son, what is that you're listening to? Oh, Dad, you know, I remember when Debbie Harry came out and she was rapping, and she wasn't rapping about nothing. And then, you know, most of the hip hop artists still don't rap about anything, but it's the music, man. I like the beat. I like the cut. So, you know, a lot of times there is no real message. Yes, again, there are some that are really trying to revolutionize the art form, but, well, again, it's an art form. It's not.
1982, yeah.
Yeah, well, is there another question?
Hey, I don't have a question, I have a comment, and I have to keep it in 2 sentences. So, just addressing, I just think when people have panel discussions like this, they really omit the differences in the societies and the communities that the 2 generations were brought up in. Because my mom, she was raised in segregation, and she's like, integration was the worst thing that ever happened to black people, because in these communities now, we don't see the black teachers, black leaders, doctors, preachers. And when you're raised in a community where you see white teachers, you see white professionals, and everyone that you see, it transforms your view of authority and who is an authority figure. So I gotta stop. She just pulled my coat. So that just messed up my groove. But I just think it's important to address that and acknowledge that there is a big difference, and you can't say that hip hop isn't a movement, because it's a movement to the people that is transforming, and they believe it. So we have to figure out how to transform the way that they think into something that is more progressive as opposed to destructive.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, and briefly, I'm glad that the young lady mentioned like other forms of hip hop, like underground hip hop is definitely rising from the dirt. So I think that we should really establish like the difference between mainstream and underground hip hop. But I was curious as to what is negative or positive like rap songs, because like mainstream hip hop is like bringing poverty, sexism, violence, like materialism all to the forefront. Is it that we get too caught up in a beat that we don't really focus on the message, because the message is there? So.
Well, I would. That's a good question. I think in terms of that mainstream hip hop, I think it does bring those things up, but it brings them up in a way where it's really not. Even if there's a critique, what most of the listeners are getting out of the message and the videos is that these things are great to have. You know, basically, because I understand what you're saying. It's almost like the anti-racist cartoons that white liberals usually do that show someone basically saying the N-word, and it's supposed to be this anti-racist cartoon. Archie Bunker is a great example. Archie Bunker, Norman Lear, that was the most racist show on television. Norman Lear was a white liberal. That show was #1 from 71 to 76, was on from 71 to 83 on CBS. And Carol O'Connor was a liberal as well, the person who played Archie Bunker. But white Americans loved Archie Bunker because he was calling George Jefferson a nigger, and they felt, hey, I agree with him. And he didn't want Poles, he didn't want gays, he didn't want Jews, he didn't want anybody around. And so that was supposed to be some kind of ironic, liberal, anti-racist message. Guess what? It was a message that was interpreted on multiple levels, and most of it was reactionary. So there is mainstream rap that does what you're saying, but people aren't getting that. But I agree that there is message rap. 1982, Melly Mel, Grandmaster and the Furious Flash. When we think about Public Enemy, Tribe Called Quest, X-Clan, Dead Prez, Mos Def, Common. I think Common's album finally went platinum, and so there's an important context there. And for the sister who's talking about the golden age of segregation, we have to remember there was no golden age of segregation. Don't believe the hype. We've got the historians and the sociologists and the urban history. When we think about 1940s, 1930s, the Jim Crow era, there was never a golden age of the ghetto, okay? The black folks who were middle class in Birmingham, they lived away from the brothers and the sisters and the workers in Birmingham. The black folks in Montgomery, Alabama during the bus boycott who could have a car to drive, some of them gave carpools to the poor folks who were maids. There has always been class structure in our community. You weren't seeing teachers and business people at the juke joints and sipping wine with the people who were homeless, okay? What happened certainly post-Jim Crow is that some black people have moved into all-white enclaves, but most black people live where black people live, other black people live. It's just that it's a class context. We've got sociological data that shows most African Americans live among African Americans. The tipping point for white neighborhoods to leave once black presence is there is 7%. 7%. Once a neighborhood goes 7% black, white folks leave. So there's never been a golden age of the ghetto. People have this nostalgia for Jim Crow, and certainly the civil rights movement did transform all black schools and administrators, and people lost jobs after the Civil Rights Act and after some integration occurred in the 70s and 80s, because that's when certain school districts started to be integrated, but there was never a golden age of the ghetto. Historically, that's a fallacy.
So they're about to kick us off the stage, so we're going to go ahead and wrap this panel discussion up. Just something shortly. I want to point to Kamozi's book, A Nation Within a Nation, when he's talking, when he references Malcolm, and Malcolm's talking about how jazz can be a paradigm for black freedom, and he's talking about how that is how we have to think when you talk about jazz not being a movement, but that was the paradigm that Malcolm said when brothers were playing the horns and they were free to think. That's when they really started to create. So the problem with hip hop right now, in my opinion, is that they're not free. They're not free. And we beat up on the mainstream people, but I like Jay. And it's not that just Jay pushes misogynistic, that he's on top. Jay is very good too. We have to.
Yeah, we're here live with Peniel Joseph, prominent writer, author. I'm telling you, I got an opportunity to see your work during Thanksgiving. Yep. You were on C-SPAN. And the information that you have been able to articulate really gives an understanding to be able to identify with many of the challenges that we were not brought to understand, in the real world. Yes. The background details. You were able to find that kind of information inherently so that you can put together a message that seems to be almost like a novel. I mean, in the way that you wrote it. Yeah. How did it feel to come up with the information that you did, and what do you think effectively is going to be able to condition individuals to understand about the Black Power movement?
Well, certainly the information came from real historical research, really 5 years of research and writing. And when we think about the Black Power movement, it's a movement that's just historically been demonized. It's a movement that people think of as violent, misogynistic, and short-lived. And what I found when you do the research is that really Black Power is going to scandalize and transform American democracy. And on one level, we've got these iconic individuals like Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Huey P. Newton, Sonia Sanchez, Amir Baraka, an extraordinary group of people, Grayson James Lee Boggs, Albert Clegg, who really transform America at the grassroots, local, national, and international level. So this information is really vital for our contemporary generation, especially our young people, because our young people are really sort of fed a canned history of the civil rights movement and really not how black people actually fought for their own self-determination and won at least partial victories.
Okay, well, you saw now in our panel discussion, yes, we talked about the identification of what really is classified as a movement. Politically, we know that it really transcends the kind of empowerment that we need to stop being oppressed. Yes. And we're able to, I guess, kind of like relate it to the artistic movement of music. Yeah. And conditioning our community, we know behavioral aspects, theoretically, can be transformed by what someone really sits down and listens to. And we learned that from Hooked on Phonics. Yes. Do you honestly believe that the cultural movement of hip-hop can have the same identity as a political movement of the Black Power era?
Well, it's potentially you could say
Perhaps, is what I would say. When we think about the Black Power movement, it's an organic political movement. It's not just a cultural movement. Because when we think about cultural movements, culture really reflects the politics of the period. So hip hop right now is a cultural movement. There's aspects of it that have tried to enact political mobilization. Russell Simmons, Puff Daddy, some of them have raised money through marathons. Some of them have built up national hip hop conventions and summits. Now, has that translated into the hip hop community being an actual voting bloc? Not as yet. You know, when that happens, will they have political power? Yes. Is that cultural movement an economic bloc? Absolutely. When we think about Echo, when we think about Sean John, when we think about Jay-Z, we have for the first time a group of entrepreneurs who've made money from a cultural industry on a way unsurpassed in American history. When we think about jazz artists, they did not make the kind of money to own their own records and their own distribution like a Jay-Z, like a Sean Puffy Combs, and like 50 Cent. So when we think about the cultural arm can potentially become a political arm, but I agree that right now, is it a straight up political movement? No. Are there political tendencies within that movement trying to turn it into a political bloc? Yes. Is it a cultural movement with huge economic implications globally in the billions? Yes, absolutely, because hip hop, the style and the aesthetic of hip hop have become so transformative for a generation of people, or really generations, that now you have clothing lines that include suits and baggy pants.
Right.
Now you have, not just records, but television shows, reality shows. So when we think about this, and when you go overseas, and this is something that we can critique, hip hop has become the face of Black American culture. And Black culture is bigger than hip hop, and some of the young people from the hip hop generation don't realize that. And certainly the media doesn't. So I think part of the problem that Cosby and an older generation have with hip hop is that hip hop has become ubiquitous as the face of Black America, and it's only part of Black America's face.
Your book, Wait Until the Midnight Hour, it's an exceptional piece of work.
Thank you.
And I can't wait to make sure that we can get it in our communities.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's just turn me and let's get a nice.